London Real, sponsored by Bulletproof Coffee.
The Indian Ocean was three guys, and so inevitably there's a greater degree of flexibility in terms of, the hours that you put in when you're rowing, and if you want to stop for a minute to tie your shoelaces, you can. That just wasn't even possible on the Atlantic. But the Indian was psychologically more difficult, a greater sense of deprivation, a much more isolated stretch of ocean, obviously twice as long, and three guys from completely different backgrounds, completely different cultures, and different continents. So, it was a trial by fire.
And you're there to film it, but obviously you can't just sit around and take the glamour shots. Did you know that you would be rowing the whole time?
That's how I got the job, really. As a single male with no dependents, I'm that guy who's cheap to insure to send to hostile locations, and I suppose the ocean is hostile, certainly where cameras are involved. Anywhere where you're combining camera equipment and salt water is a potential hazard. But from the minute we got out there, the Indian Ocean didn't go lightly on us. Our water maker failed after a week. We were hand pumping from an emergency desalinator. The boat we discovered had some holes in it, in the ballast tanks, which made us at risk of capsize and spoilt a lot of our food. We were living on almost a kilo of chocolate a day by the last sort of fortnight. Our satellite navigation equipment failed in a storm, very limited battery power. So it was, it went back to sort of rowing in the dark ages, is how my Viking compadre Levar described it.
And who makes the call whether you abort the mission? Like, who says, all right, this is ridiculous? I mentioned to someone you had holes in your boat, and they're like, that's...
We came very close. I don't take credit for us breaking that world record. 80% of it comes down to good weather, good conditions, but 20% of it comes down to good experience. And Levar and I had both rowed oceans before, and there was a couple of points where the skipper kind of turned to us hesitantly and said, we might have to prepare to abandon ship here. I don't know how much more of this we can take. Our auto helm failed. We tied pieces of rope onto the rudder and were steering by hand manually in the dark with no equipment to warn us of tankers coming. We at one stage came within 3 minutes of a collision course with an unmanned Chinese vessel that had no one on the VHF. So it was life and death out there, absolutely no doubt about it. But we did have that experience to turn to the skipper and sort of say, we're still making water. We're having to hand pump for a couple of extra hours a day. But until that goes, I say we keep going. And if we'd call for rescue, it could take anywhere up to a week for someone to reach us. So I felt that we were safer on the boat. Levar and Max felt the same. And, at least we were in charge of our own destinies to some extent.
It must be a really strange environment when you're with each other 24 hours a day. And, there's technically a leadership structure. But, I'm sure all it takes is a little power of suggestion or you getting frustrated. The other guy is getting pissed off, and the captain's like, well, Jesus, I don't have a crew anymore.
Absolutely. It was much more fluid. And you had a situation where the skipper had not rowed an ocean before, and he had less experience of ocean rowing than either myself or particularly Levar, who was a lifetime mariner. So you were put in a situation where decision-making was a more fluid process. And also, that meant that there was a lot of disagreements. There was times where actually I had to drop the camera and run at the two guys because I didn't want it to escalate into a physical situation. I'm pleased to say that it didn't, but there was some really, really tough times and some real screaming matches that I filmed. So I'm going to have to exercise as much impartiality as possible when it comes to editing that material together, because obviously I'm there, and to some extent I guess I'm biased.
Yeah, you probably
what are the disagreements primarily over?
The running of the boat,
Yeah.
How the shift system should operate.
Sure.
In a traditional ocean row, there's never been a crossing by 3 men before. That was how we got one of the world records. It was the first 3-man team ever to row an ocean. But usually it's 2 hours on, 2 hours off. It's very regimented. It's very structured. We had this problem, this inflexibility, or also potentially this opportunity to exploit a different shift cycle because there were 3 of us. And in the end, we settled, instead of the traditional 12 hours a day rowing, we settled on an 11-hour row day. And that enabled every man to get something called a dog shift, where you'd have an uninterrupted break of three and a half hours to rest, rather than just 90-minute to 2-hour increments. And I think that was a massive advantage to us, actually, because the body and the mind under the duress of sleep deprivation doesn't behave normally, and that was one of the greatest difficulties that we faced on the first ocean row crossing on the Atlantic. The difficulty was that it was hard to keep track of. Sometimes you never really knew when you were on shift or not, and so there was a lot of arguments about that, and just the general things, the day-to-day running of the boat, and the degree of selflessness that was required. Some people were better team players than others, should we say?
On the big journey. On
No,
the Atlantic,
on the small journey.
On the small journey.
Yeah. On the Atlantic, you had tough guys who were ex-Olympians paired with people who were just middle-aged and wanted to have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So, there was like a whole society on that boat, 14 guys there. But, after an initial period where, there was a few revolts and it felt like a little like Lost Boys, we gelled very well and we came together very strongly as a team. On the Indian, it was much more complex because of the three personalities on board, and because ultimately we were much more like brothers than teammates. We shouted and we snapped, and people said things that they should, probably look back and wish they'd never said. And that was just the nature of the trip, I suppose.
And then at the same time, it's weird because the two guys rowing it probably want the smoothest, fastest mission possible, and then you got Stuart here, who's I like any film director is thinking, this is a fucking gem. I'm going to use this in the first part of the half-hour series. I mean, ultimately people love conflict. That's why they watch anything on
Drama
television.
needs conflict. You've got to have conflict. Yeah. And there were situations initially where there were arguments brewing between the other two crew members, and I'd grab the camera and the skipper would be like, put the camera down, everything's fine. I'd be like, come on, we're not making a propaganda movie here. Right. This is what people want to watch. Conflict requires drama, and I had to fight my corner on that, and that's something that's not typically British thing to do. You tend to be more polite about that, and you can't afford that as an adventure cameraman. But within a week or two, people forgot the camera was there. And that's the beauty of spending 57 days in a confined environment. People are going to show their true colours, and you're going to have the opportunity to demonstrate that visually.
Did you have a talk before you went on the trip and just said, look, here are the rules, everything is good, I can film anything? Was there a protocol like in the military, like ultimately is this guy's call, or was all this kind of fluid?
Well,
First, the filming stuff. Is there anything you said to him, I won't film this, or I won't do this?
I told him I'd film everything. We were, as I say, we were 3 minutes from abandoning ship. Less than. I was grabbing emergency kit to throw overboard.
Was this China vessel coming at you?
When there's this China vessel just bearing down on us.
And it's unmanned or
Well, there was no one on the VHF. There was no one on a system called the AIS, which all major tankers have to alert other boats. We were carrying it as a rowing vessel. This ship was probably trafficking. It was very dilapidated. There was no one on the helm, and they were just bearing down on us. And whilst the guys were frantically trying to grab water makers and spare food, I was thinking SD cards, lights, what am I going to need in that raft? Which, because, I was filming it the whole way. I was running around screaming like a girl while they were frantically trying to, hail it down on the VHF. It's something, my greatest fear had always been being mowed down. The ocean rowing incidents where people have died on ocean rows, the boats have just vanished. They've just completely vanished.
So they were.
Reason being, they were mowed down by a boat that was far larger than them.
I just would think statistically there's nothing going on but the rent in the middle of the ocean.
And this is what Lever argued with me. He turned to me and said, Stu, relax, there's more chance of us getting, more chance of you running across the Sahara Desert and getting hit by a 4x4. Like, this is the biggest desert in the world. We're not going to see another ship. And, I remember knocking on his door and waking him up, Levi, you've got to take a look at this. And then he pops his head out and he's like, yeah, it's going to miss us. And I was like, really? He's like, well, that's wishful thinking because it's coming right at us. And I was like, what are we going to do? He's like, if it doesn't move out of the way, we're going to have to get the life raft out and hope that we can swim far enough away from the flotsam and then swim back and climb into the life raft.
What's a flotsam?
Just, when the boat would hit, there'd be loads of debris. The boat would be completely annihilated, and the jetsam and flotsam is the stuff that would just kind of float on the top. And we'd have to hope that we'd be able to see the life raft, which in theory would self-inflate.
Okay. In theory.
in theory.
And how far away could you see the ship?
This was coming at us. It was about 100 meters away, I guess.
So you saw it at the last minute? Or could you see it for like miles out?
No,
Like,
I saw it from about probably 10 minminutes away. And then we immediately started hailing it, and grabbing flares to set off and so forth. But it just didn't answer. And it just kept coming right at us. And then, periodically, the waves, the prevailing swell was coming on that day from the west. So it would kind of tilt off as if it was going to just miss our stern. But then it would just straighten back up again. And eventually, when somebody on the helm, somebody actually walking along the side of the boat on the gunwale did see us, and they must have redirected, but they were kind of, curious at the same time, so they'd obviously stayed quite close to us, and they were only, 50 meters or so away from us.
What can you do? I mean, you can't jump out and swim because that might be a worse fate. You just stay on the boat and then you jump left to right. I mean, it's a big.
That was
Yeah.
my plan. My plan was just have a grab bag of emergencies and jump off when it became inevitable that it was going to hit, and then swim back to the wreckage and try and inflate that life raft. But
That's pretty optimistic.
that's coming from a cameraman who spent a lot of time filming at sea. The mariner told me, well, he just clambered back into the cabin to go back to sleep because he said, if it hits us, we're all dead. So I'm going to...
That's really what he did.
Yeah, he just climbed back in the cabin. He was like, there's nothing I can do about it. Just climb it. And then this
I
is
still get
probably...
a couple last hours of sleep.
It's probably the toughest guy I've ever met. He's the first man on the planet to ever row 2 oceans in a year, potentially a third later this year. He was pulling 8-hour shifts at the end.
Rowing.
Rowing. I was doing 4 hours on, 1 hour off, 4 hours on as we got closer to that record. I used to stretch after every 2-hour shift to try and keep myself a bit nimble. And I remember him turning and going, Stuart, I stretch once after each ocean row. He's just a big ball of gristle.
Yeah.
And do you have to pace yourself on the row? Is there like any kind of like timing you do? Or?
Absolutely. On the Atlantic, there was a division between the young, fit guys who went hell for leather out of Gran Canaria across the Atlantic for Barbados. And after 2 weeks, physically, they were depleted, one after another after another. And, those old guys who we'd written off, who were 50 years old, 45 years old, they were like diesel engines. They just kept going. And they're the ones who pulled us into the home straight and got us the world record. On the Indian, I was much better prepared, and I knew that, I wasn't going to go in there all cocky, this young, fit guy. I was, 10 years younger than Levar, 20 years younger than Max. I went in thinking it's a long haul, so I always tried to pace myself, and I was much happier with my physical performance. I never dropped a shift, anything like that. So.
This week, London Real meets UFC fighter Dan Hardy.
I'm not an athlete, I'm a fighter that's trying to be a martial artist.
His wins and his losses.
That's it, I'm done. I'm not enjoying it anymore. This is not fun for me anymore. I'm not getting anything out of it, I'm just getting damaged.
He talks the spirit world.
The thing is, like, ayahuasca doesn't necessarily do anything to change the person. It just helps the person understand who they are.
And introduces the wolf heart.
They want to feed the wires into my heart so they can measure the second heartbeat. They can then burn it.
This Sunday, London Real presents Dan Hardy, Uncut.
Every subject's on the table, so feel free to ask away.